Folks, hello and welcome here to Dev Diary number 93 for Victoria 3. I already covered this, of course, in a separate and edited video so that you got all of the information that is really required to know what is going on, but I want to expand on all of this because you know what we do on this channel. We discuss the mechanics, how they're implemented, what it could be, what it currently is, and what in general is going on. And with this Dev Diary covers everything related to the military improvements in the open beta. Let me tell you, I have plenty of opinions, I have plenty of thoughts, and this will probably be one of the toughest videos because it will be incredibly long, and it's currently 1 million degrees, which means that I will be melting in front of your eyes over that incredibly long period. Feel free to leave comments throughout the video as you are watching it, solely because there are so many topics in here and so many considerations that it might be a bit much for just a couple of individual comments. With all that being said, we're gonna jump in straight away. If you're more interested in certain topics than you are compared to other topics, then make sure to jump through the video with the actual chapters in the video. And do not forget that we do cover the Dev Diary here, and we will be covering the dev team responses. So there will also be just a couple of different segments there in this video as well. Again, as I said, and as you probably can tell, this is a very, very long video. Alright, and first things first, let's talk about the logistics of the open beta, because this is of course very important. There's a lot going on here, and I would recommend that just for the logistics, you actually check out this Dev Diary yourself with the actual link in the description, of course, because, well, this is relevant for you if you want to test this, if you want to jump into the open beta and leave feedback, if you hate certain things, if you love certain things. Make sure that you leave, of course, that impact, and you can do that by following the instructions that you see laid out right here in this Dev Diary. But all those things aside, I will just say that we already had an open beta that was the Open Beta 1.2, and that one went really, really well. I will say, if you have a fairly limited dev team size, if it's difficult to test everything with the playtest capabilities, of course, that you have in, I believe they have actually, it's not outsourced at all. I believe User Research has their own playtests, their own computers, their own lab, and so on for Victoria 3. Well, no, sorry, for Paradox games in general in Stockholm. But yeah, if you are more interested in the wider thing to support that, because again, there's of course a lot going on there, then ultimately I think that this open beta is a really good idea. It goes beyond the capabilities that they would normally have, and it allows you to give direct feedback that otherwise you could only give if you are selected for one of their surveys to, you know, be a playtester. With that being said, let's take a look at the actual thing right here. The launch date of the open beta in general will be August 28th. In the initial release, new features will be in a rudimentary state, with plenty of placeholder interfaces, graphics, and missing mechanical details. Many features will be exploitable and buggy, and absolutely not balanced. Some features will be unused or underused by the AI. Core components of the game that we have not touched should continue to work, so playing a game focused on economy and politics should not be heavily affected by these changes. But be aware that military campaigns may feel unsatisfying or cumbersome. Again, because we are getting a massive rework here, but obviously that comes in stages when it comes to the completion. Now, the important part here for you as a player is, if you wish to partake in testing this update, focus on feedbacking on what additions or balance changes would make the new features fun. So that is the angle that you should take it. That is very important because the other stages of the open beta require a different approach when it comes to feedbacking. Not on whether they feel great right now, because, well, they won't. That is basically what they're saying. Then the second update, tentative launch mid-September. By this time, the new features should feel a lot more mature, with bugs and missing information graphics filled in, additional mechanical details, closing exploits, and providing new optimization challenges, and in general more bells and whistles available to you. While beta testing this update, in addition to the aforementioned considerations, focus on balance and UX improvements. Now, this update to me is insanely important. Victoria 3 has had a lot of trouble with UX. I think we can all agree on that, no matter where we stand elsewhere. And it has gotten better, it has gotten significantly better, but already looking just over what we have here, I'm like, oh god, this should look differently. So yeah, definitely focus on feedbacking there. That is again launching in mid-September, at least that is the approach that they're taking. And then the last update to the open beta before it launches into the full 1.5 release comes in mid-October. If all goes as planned, at this point we should be fully feature complete for the 1.5 release. This doesn't mean everything is wrapped up and ready to go. We will be spending the time between this update and the final release fixing bugs, doing balance updates, and reacting to your feedback. While testing this update, you should be able to focus on how fun the game is to play with the new features. So right here, it comes down to what is the actual full experience like. If you are more casual in your approach to these features, if you don't want to sit down, and quite frankly, if you sit down watching this video, listening to it in the background, then I assume you're not part of this group. But if you are one of the people that are saying, I don't really want to test features that aren't fully done yet, that are still very buggy and so on, then this is the update that you might want to jump into to give feedback, because here you jump in and you say, I'm having a bad time, I'm having a good time because of this or that feature, because of this or that implementation, and so on. So that might be where you want to come in. If you are one of the people that are saying, I'm really interested in the theory behind the mechanics, I'm interested in analyzing how they work and why they work this way, and maybe there should be some more fundamental changes, then I think an earlier update for the beta is your choice instead. Now, the important part here is that this entire beta is of course running through Steam. You can opt into that, and then your feedback is primarily collected via the Discord. Now, I will tell you right now, I'm not going to go through this section all too much. This is mostly for you for the setup once the open beta launches on the 28th of August. You can opt into it as you can with any beta on Steam, and then most of the feedback is handled in Discord. I have participated very actively in the 1.2 open beta way back. Oh god, was this March? Was this February? I can't remember, but whenever that was, basically in the time period, and the Discord channel, or well, the Discord forum option that we had there was really, really good. I think it worked excellently, and Pelly, even back then, went very diligently through every single post, through every single iteration of feedback, and I think that was a really good experience from both sides, just in how well the feedback could be organized and in how fluidly you could discuss it. Discord is surprisingly good there in that context. I never thought that the threads and the forums would be of any use to anybody, but I was completely wrong. I'm not going to go through all the details right here because, well, basically just take it in and, you know, read this for yourself if you want to join the open beta. It is purely logistical. It is basically purely bureaucratic here, and that is something you can take in if you actually want to participate. For everybody else, this won't be too important. All right, and with that, we have the logistical stuff behind us, and we can move on to what is more relevant, I think, for anybody that anticipates the beta and, of course, the result of the beta, which then are the finished gameplay systems, by understanding what is actually coming our way. Let's start by taking a look what the general understanding, the vision of these reworks is. Now, let's jump into the juicy stuff. For these features, we are looking to improve the military gameplay in three broad areas: agency, depth, and visuals. By agency, we mean the degree of control the player feels they have over their military campaigns. Equally important to granting more agency is ensuring the player doesn't experience a lack of agency, for example by having more fronts to manage than generals, uncontrollable, unpredictable front splitting, or armies that suddenly return home because their general decided an active front was an opportune place to die of old age. Yeah, so basically, I think agency is very important, and agency in this context, and I'm very, very happy that they recognize this in this particular paragraph as a mission statement. Agency in Victoria 3 suffers not exclusively because of a lack of agency, but of a very distinct aggressiveness of non-agency, right? Where you look at something that happens and you say there was literally nothing that could have influenced any of this. This just shouldn't be in the game. For example, the front splitting and then you being caught with your pants down for no reason whatsoever. These are the sort of things that negatively affect you. Well, they just shouldn't be there. There can be features that, you know, exist in a fashion, in a state that basically don't give you enough agency, but these so proactively take it away in a very non-existing way, so they basically shouldn't be there in general. That being recognized is very, very important. We see this, of course, as we then walk through the features as well. I will say in general, before we even jump into the actual features, the features that we now see introduced here definitely feed into the strengths, at least in theory. We will see the implementation, of course, going forward, but they feed into the strengths of what could make such a warfare system good, much, much more than the current iteration actually does. Now, the next one is depth. Depth refers to both detail and realism. More military attributes and configuration options, armies and fleets that are composed and behave more like you'd expect from history, thank God, and more interesting decision-making during warfare. This was, I think, the primary, next to, obviously, now when we actually had hands-on experience with the military system, I think it is very clear that the vast majority of players feels that the system just isn't interactive enough. It's not interesting enough, there's not enough agency and so on, and that is true, but at the same time, at least in theory, and then also in practice, of course, what we discussed a whole lot was the actual depth of things. How deep is it to, you know, put people on the front and then interact with them there? Adding more depth there is fundamental to the concept of making a non-stack movement-based system interesting to the player. And by the way, forgive me here, I got sweat running down my face because, again, it's a million degrees. But this is one of the primary things. Again, we have the other option right here with agency. Yes, this is important, and yes, this needs to be addressed, but depth is so crazy important because you're taking perceived depth away by removing stacks, right? And this needs to be addressed. This needs to be then added on a different layer. Here on the channel, we're big friends of advocating for a feature primarily around, you know, the OOBs, so the Order of Battle, and of course everything related to military academies, to the military establishment, making that more interesting over the 100 years that are of course part of Victoria 3, rather than the actual front occurrences. Because what happens at the front ultimately always will be a result of what happens in the back. Now the OOB, military academies, all that stuff is currently completely missing, but that is something that I've personally always advocated for because I find that angle super interesting. It's so connected to your society, it's so connected to your politics, and of course also connected then to your actual troops in the field. But this depth is majorly important. It gets a very short paragraph here because agency is the more immediately troubling issue where it actively sort of is abrasive, it is very aggressive against you, and just very agitating when it comes to how you interact with it, but the depth is then what will enrich a system that doesn't have stack-based movement by adding stuff instead of stack-based movement. And then the last one is visuals require little introduction. It's about what we have come to affectionately refer to internally as little dudes on the map, seeing your armed forces in action, in transit, and being able to put a concrete location on everything, which also helps with agency. Now, I do want to talk a bit meta here. I think visuals are really important, don't get me wrong here. I think I've played a myriad of indie titles, be it in the grand strategy sphere, in the 4X sphere, in the just generally strategy sphere, and I think a lot of them struggle, and I mean this both in how they feel when you play them, but also financially, purely on aesthetics. Generally, I think the indie scene in the strategy and the grand strategy sphere has it insanely difficult, or has an insanely difficult mountain to climb because we have such high standards now in the modern day. It was much, much easier if you go back to 2005 because there wasn't really that much going on there. The tech employed in games back then when it came to the representation of troops was much less good, and if you don't have anything today, it's much worse than it would have been way back in the day. Now, visuals in Victoria 3, doubtlessly very disappointing. I remember when we first talked about the War Dev Diaries, when that came out, right? Long before the game launched, we took a look at that and we basically said, yeah, this just, I really hope it's temporary. It was not temporary at the time, it was released that way, and it was very underwhelming, right? You look at that, you just have these flames and they are 2D, and then you have the actual battle sprites when the battle goes on, and those are fairly static, not much is happening there, and beyond that you don't see any representation of your troops. Now, if you have already no stack-based movement, which means there are no concrete locations to your troops on the map as is, and then you have no real representation, that will impact how people perceive their agency much, much more than you might expect. It's one of those factors, I think, that if you're a game dev, or if you're a player even, that doesn't think about that too often, because you primarily play games or design games based on the mechanical impact, right? You will think about visuals and say, oh, who cares, we can add that later. I have grown to really think visuals play like a massive role. It's very similar to UX and UI, right? If I have the most amazing mechanics, but none of it is revealed in a cool way, in a way that is accessible, in a way that makes fun to interact with it, and that lets you understand what is going on just by looking at the sprites, the graphics, whatever, you will run into an issue where you might have mechanics, where you might have great stuff, but people look at it and say there's nothing there because they literally cannot see it. This is a huge fact, this is a huge case, and I will already tell you, before we jump into this, when it comes to what they now want to do here, and I say this very cautiously, because who knows what the actual implementation looks like, right? The actual features there. But what they're doing is more than what I expected when it comes to how you should address this. I think they could have done less and would have already addressed many of the issues that I just pointed out here, but they're doing something that is really, really interesting to me, and I hope that sort of elevates our view on how agency is impacted by visuals. We're going to see how that, of course, pans out so far. Many of the dreams that we have may be shattered. All right, sorry, folks. If you can hear the fan, then my apologies. I had to turn it up because I'm actually dying. I'm sweating beyond belief. Okay, listen. The point about visuals for me is that it's almost as important to me as the actual mechanical underlying growth. Because if you can't see it, then it's not there in almost all cases. It's not going to give you the same feeling. I, for example, have a big problem with HOI 4 because it just doesn't feel as sort of field marshal-y as HOI 3 did. And HOI 3's OOB, for example, is arguably awful in comparison to HOI 4, but it just felt more intense. It felt more real, right? So I think this is a really, really important part. Hoi 3 is way, way worse about its constituent parts compared to Hoi 4, but it feels better to me. And I think this is a really big aspect. So I'm very happy to see that they are going above and beyond in this respect, because otherwise, again, it could suffer as it does. You can have anything that is amazing. It doesn't matter if you cannot identify it. And with all this, let's move on to the actual features, to the individual segments that we want to talk about today, starting with shared fronts. This is, of course, a very, very important aspect. Not too long ago, a friend of mine said, what is the actual benefit from having fronts instead of theaters? If you just have a theater, what's the drawback? What a theater can't do compared to front lines? And I've pondered that ever since, and honestly, I can't identify it. I'm not entirely certain whether there is a benefit. If you had, instead of an entire region, instead of a front line. And that seems to be a lesson that now here sort of is also going into this, because shared fronts essentially create theaters instead of front lines. So let's take a look at it. One issue that can rear its ugly head from time to time in the current version of Victoria 3 is the very large number of fronts that you may be dealing with at any given moment. Many of you have pointed out that this leads to mandatory micromanagement of the war effort, which defeats the design goal that led us to create a more hands-off system for Victoria 3 in the first place. Reducing the number of fronts, especially in wars involving several countries on either side, to a more manageable number is a big priority for us. The first in a 1-2 punch effort to solve this problem is to make fronts adjacent between 2 or more allied countries into a single unified front. This can drastically reduce the number of fronts active at the start of a war. There isn't that much more to say about shared fronts, which is a good thing. While quite complex in implementation and we still have a few edge cases to sort out, they do what it says on the tin and are very intuitive to play. Here's an example of a single front, Bavaria and Württemberg on one side, and Hesse, Frankfurt and Baden on the other. In the current live version, this would be 4 unique fronts. I remember when we played Victoria 3 at PDXCon. I mean, I brought this up specifically as well in the really, really long video covering my experience with Victoria 3 at PDXCon. That Germany, any war in Germany was so damn painful. Any war in India, so damn painful. So the solution now is to just unify these front lines. Now you might say, okay, the trouble here could be you unify these front lines, and all of a sudden, how do you actually specialize on attacking in a particular location if you can't do that? We have a partial solution for this with the strategic objectives, but the way battles are now selected, you will see, sort of gets rid of that worry. You really now get, instead of a front line, a theater. You get a theater, and then you decide where to engage with the enemy at the theater, or the enemy, of course, decides to engage with you at that theater if they are on the attacking side. What we can see right here, and let me get rid of this, I think it's like, where is it? There. What you can see right here is the aforementioned front line. It is a single front line. You can see the troops participating on either side. You see the Baden troops, you see the Württemberg troops, and you see Frankfurt, and then right here, and we got Hesse as well, yep, and Bavaria. All of them are at war, and this is one unified location. Again, it would be split massively otherwise, beforehand, but now it doesn't do that anymore. It is much more flexible. It is just much cooler because, well, it's just simplified. I said this in the Aftermath videos to Voice of the People as well. I said that the thing that I care about primarily, the only thing that really moves me, is getting rid of features that make my experience worse, right? We can have really cool mechanics, but if I get annoyed because my fronts keep splitting, everything sucks. So this whole thing is eliminated. You see the individual troops, and now that you see them represented properly, we're going to talk about that more later as well. You couldn't have that in the current version either, but there will be, of course, more added to this going forward when it comes to where the troops are. Concrete locations plays a big role. Doesn't matter right now. To understand shared fronts, I think we don't really have to debate much. It's just fundamentally a much better feature. Long term, I'll tell you right now as well, I'm still like, maybe theaters just would be better. We're active in this strategic theater, we're active in that strategic theater. There's not much of a difference anymore between that approach and just unified front lines. It's all the same, right? Because you basically participate in a theater, then determine where you want to attack, and that is where you really are, right? So fundamentally, this is just moving to theaters, and I'm all for it. I think there are, not that I can see any, but I don't think there are any drawbacks here. And now we come here to state-based front movement, which is the second aspect of the changes made to front lines, and I think a very important one because it directly supplements exactly where state-based strategic objectives are going, because it sort of contains what you're doing and makes it easy for you to anticipate what happens both on a friendly and an enemy side if they win or if you were to win. Let's take a look at this. The second strike in a fight against too numerous and unpredictable fronts is state-based front movement. While merging adjacent fronts is a method of controlling the initial number of fronts between known participants, the bigger problem for most players is the unpredictable front splitting and merging that happens during the course of war, as battles are won and small pocket theaters are created. This feature eliminates the uncertainty of what might happen once a battle concludes, and drastically reduces the number of temporary fronts that emerge, which then causes you to lose the war because you don't have another general to staff it with, so your enemy stomps all over you. I saw a very recent screenshot on that for Denmark. Somebody was invading Schleswig, and Schleswig is very peculiar because it has this way over to, what is that, Odense, right? The island next to where Copenhagen is. And then it goes also further north, of course, which means you get like 2-3 front lines and you just got one invading front. So yeah, it really sucks, right? Now this is how it works. Battles will be fought in a province like before, but when you win, you capture a fraction of the state that province is in, not a number of provinces. Only one state can be captured at a time, and only once the whole thing has been captured will the front actually move. As part of this, we also have permitted battles to be disconnected from front lines, so you won't be attacking only the border provinces repeatedly until you have won the entire state. In our current build, the province is chosen randomly from provinces in the state, but during open beta, we will enhance this to select from provinces deeper and deeper into the state depending on occupation already earned. Right, so to make this clear, let's discuss quickly how this works in case you can't envision this. If we have a front line between Prussia and its allies, and then of course Austria and her allies, we would be looking at, well, you know, along Silesia, maybe along Bohemia. Let's say, for example, that Saxony participates on the Prussian side, and then somewhere it splits in the middle states in the west. Doesn't matter. My strategic objective right here is Bohemia. That I am Prussia, and I want to take Bohemia. I will fight battle after battle after battle after battle, and at some point I will have 100% occupation score on Bohemia, and when that is the case, Bohemia flips, the front line moves further, and I now border all of the states that border Bohemia as well. So instead of me potentially conquering, and then part of Bohemia flipping, but also part of Slovakia flipping, and maybe a single tile in Vienna, in Austria proper flipping, and then that taking the war score to -100, I would be just focusing on Bohemia, and once we're done with Bohemia, we move on to whatever state comes after. This is a lot cleaner and can be combined with multiple battles so that you can work on flipping multiple states at the same time and make partial progress as you go. That is how this works, just in case you weren't certain how to envision this properly. Now this is a battle right here. You can see multiple battles have already been fought. I believe this is the war against Piratini that that Brazil is fighting at the start of the game, and you can see these battles going on right there. As the battle concludes, the winning side earns a victory score, currently just a flat value, but this will eventually be changed to be conditional on the size of the victory. This victory score is allocated towards gaining or clearing occupation in states adjacent to the front, depending on the winning side. Defenders will only clear occupation, while attackers will clear some from their own states, if any, and gain some in the state they attacked. So let's go back to the example that we have right here, of course, between Austria and Prussia. If we occupy a part of Bohemia and they previously have occupied a part of Silesia, and now they win in the defense, right, they will start clearing a bit of Bohemia. If I win in the attack for Bohemia, as I understand it at the very least, I will also be clearing a part in Silesia, so that I basically move the front in general, well, not the front, but the occupation, and then also clear a part in Bohemia. I think this is perfectly fine. I don't really have any complaints here. The calculation right now, of course, is a flat value. Having that depend on more things will be really cool, and you're going to see this right here as well, that there is more coming. I am, in general, I think, very, very happy with how this works. In the current version of Victoria 3, the number of provinces gained on winning a battle are dependent on the size of the win, the stats of the advancing general, and some randomness within a min-max range. With 1.5, the amount of occupation gained in a state from a battle is dependent instead on a comparison between the victory score and the occupation cost of the states in question. The occupation cost is determined by a number of factors: state population, amount of provinces with difficult terrain, number of mobilized battalions left standing in the defender's theater compared to the size of the theater. Both victory score and occupation cost are broken down in the UI and fully scriptable/moddable. We intend on tweaking both during the open beta phase heavily in response to your feedback, to make sure states that are supposed to be hard to take are actually more challenging to conquer, without it becoming a slog, while depopulated savannas are easier to march across. What we found in testing this feature is that in addition to controlling the sudden appearance of new fronts, this new feature also makes it very easy to determine whether you are in control of a particular war goal. In the future, we hope to add new mechanics tied into this feature, such as economic exploitation of states occupied during war. An example of the new outcome of battle and the occupation cost breakdown. In this case, Piratini should have gotten to plant their flags across 87% of the state, but some advanced math, aka a bug, as described in the screenshot, only granted 10%. Guess it's back to the coal mines for me. This right here is an overview of this. Occupation costs Santa Catarina 1,000, 62k population gives a plus 62, hazardous provinces, forested, elevated provinces, all of these impacted, and then infrastructure usage compensating for difficult terrain. So if you have difficult terrain but really high infrastructure, all of a sudden, you can still navigate it pretty easily. I liked it a lot. I think there's a lot that can be done with that going forward. Then Occupation 1, again, it is of course not correct, but be that as it may, this is just a bug thing anyway. Speaking of flags, while it won't be in the initial open beta build, this is one way we plan on visualizing partial state occupation despite the front line itself not moving, in addition to shading the terrain itself. So the front line remains where it is until we conquer all of Bohemia, in our previous example, but these flags will be planted in Prague and so on and so forth, and we know we've taken this. This is currently occupied by us, and to take it back, they either have to sign a peace treaty or we have to be in a position where they push us back. The big question here is, of course, how does occupation actually impact state war goal achievement? Do you need to get 100% occupation? Do you need to get 50%? Do you need to get 1%? These are the big questions. Right now, it's literally 1%. If you hold a single tile in anywhere in the state region that you need to take, then you get taking war score. Well, the war support of the enemy can drop below -100. So we will see how this works. But, and I think this is very important to say, fundamentally, this seems excellent. Obviously, currently, and this is also how it is discussed, you have one battle per front. They are discussing this further down the line, how you could have multiple battles right here, and multiple battles right here. I have objected to multiple battles at numerous times on this channel here, because my thinking was that numerous battles that are truly independent of one another, just because you have more generals, for example, make things worse fundamentally, because you just spam out generals and you go from there. Having it be state-based makes it much easier to say, this is Theater A, which is State A, this is Theater B, which is State B, and we're fighting over those simultaneously. Again, previously that wasn't really viable because you could have multiple battles. You see this already right now. If you come and you have, for example, any kind of country that is surrounded by other people and there's two front lines around it, you attack from two sides and that country can't assign somebody over here, boom, they creep into the country, the entire country is gone, while that one battle is raging on the other side. That is what I always thought would be the consequence there. But with state-based movement, I don't think that will be a problem anymore. State-based movement, I can actually see multiple battles occurring without breaking down everything that, well, makes this sort of an expectable system, where you have expectable outcomes rather than unpredictable nonsense that will just throw you off your mojo. In general, I think this is a really good approach to solve this. Again, every state that you advance into sort of acts like a theater, if you want to look at it from that angle, and making fronts just something that you can then choose where the theater should be. Very excellent, I think. I think this should cut down on most of the exploits, most of the super annoying stuff, and hopefully all of the annoying stuff, but we'll see how it is, of course, in the actual implementation. Oh yeah, another question here will still actually be, what happens if 3 countries are at war, or well, 1 country is at war with 2 other countries in individual wars, and both of those enemies are pushing into the same state? What happens to the occupation? If both of them occupy 50%, do the front lines move? Do they not move? What happens there? That is an edge case that I'm not sure about, and that I think is super important, because it could block you out of winning a war, out of getting war support to -100. That is the edge case that I am fascinated by here, but the rest seems very solid. Now, I will close out this section by saying that while multiple simultaneous battles per front won't be in the initial beta release, should be coming in the first or second update, the way we plan to implement and balance them is to only allow 1 battle per front per state at a time. This means you would only potentially benefit from having more generals than your enemy on particularly long fronts, and even then, only if you outnumber their defending troops. This is, however, an area we are actively going to solicit feedback on, and you will hear more about it in future dev diaries. So, as mentioned, I can absolutely see multiple battles working here. What I am not a fan of is the focus on having more generals present than your enemy. I don't think that should play a role at all. Having 1 general should still allow you to have that 1 general, if they have enough troops in their military formation. We're going to get to military formation. I have a lot of thoughts on those. It should allow you to push into 2 states with that general. I do not think at all that the number of generals should be influencing how many front movements you can have. I am of the opinion that this should potentially be something that should be pushed forward by having offensive values. So, for example, at the very start of your playthrough, let's say a certain superiority at the front, or let's say just a general military formation being present, gives you the ability to attack one state. In the future, that might be different. In the future, that might be different in the sense that if you have high-tech equipment for your troops, that your trench warfare troops can actually attack 2 or 3 or 4 states at the same time if that front line is long enough. So it should be something, in my opinion, that is tech advanced, that is equipment advanced, rather than how many generals do you have present, because that just encourages you to keep pressing the recruit general button so that you have enough generals to actually get the full width of the front line. I'm not a fan of tying any of that to generals at all. Generals already have enough impact as is on battles. I don't think that should influence whether I can advance. Yeah, that is definitely one of my things here. The other thing as well that I do want to mention here is that I also can see this system, since now states basically become mini theaters within the broader theater of a frontline. I can see a system where at the very start, you have one battle per state per front. So for example, if we try to attack Bohemia, there's one battle, that battle ends. It's another battle, that battle ends. But if we have high-tech, if we have trench warfare, instead of one battle being started by one advance into that theater, into the theater of Bohemia, and we've discussed this here on the channel as well. I know I'm repeating myself on those things, but I want to summarize all of this in this video, basically. Instead of having that, you would have one battle or one advance that is triggered, but that triggers 4 or 5 smaller battles, right? You can win 3, lose 2, you make small advances, you gain some small losses, right? Well, obviously you make more advances than you make losses, but you know where I'm coming from here. I think that is something, and that is, just for the record, much more viable now to be balanced and can be implemented if you exclusively have state-based movements. So, while that isn't in, and while they don't seem to be prioritizing that sort of thing at all, I would love to see that, and I think it's more viable if any gain that you get from those provinces is either retaking stuff that you lost, or it is taking stuff in the common theater that these battles have in common, which is Bohemia. Which would make it so, let's say you have a front line that goes from Alsace-Lorraine all the way to Flanders and Wallonia. In those states, you would then have 12 battles, right? But those are ultimately just 3 advances in any of those regions, in any of those states. That would be super cool. I think it would be a really neat approach, because it would really reflect, of course, as well, how you're proceeding, what an offensive looks like at the start of the game. At the start of the game, advancing into Bohemia means you have 1 or 2 armies making march, going to the cities, and of course trying to sort of catch the other armies off guard and then destroying them, whereas later in the game, it would be a fight over every single tile, over every single province. Having 1 advance in the early game would be 1 battle. Having 1 advance in the late game would be 15 battles over 1 very bloody singular advance. We can see that, I primarily can see this in the system much more than I could ever see it in the frontline system as we had it previously, where it was all individually frontline based. So yeah, big fan about that for sure. Another question, obviously, just for the record, and we don't have any answers, so I can't say anything about this, is how does, for example, like the Ottoman-Russian front, how is that handled now? The Ottoman-Russian front is madness, because it goes through the Black Sea. Yeah, how fronts are generated, I think, will be a big question going forward still, but clearly they're now destined to be more theaters, and quite frankly, by virtue of being primarily theaters rather than actual front lines, we're looking at a situation where you can have a Russian-Turkish experience that isn't pain and doesn't feel awkward just because the Black Sea is in the middle, because again, you're still focusing on just very particular states. Now here we come to one of the biggest topics of this actual dev diary, and that is military formations. And I have a lot of thoughts on this, good and bad. And we may spend a substantial amount of time on this, after already spending a substantial amount of time on shared fronts, despite that being a fairly tiny topic. Let's move into this, let's get it done, okay? This feature has a number of sub-features that I'll go into in some detail, but first a bit of background to what this is and why we're doing it. Having generals and admirals as the leaders of your armed forces is great both for flavor and for the knock-on effects it can have on the political system, but in retrospect, characters are simultaneously too static and too ephemeral to serve as good containers of military units for a player to control. I have a huge issue with the way the game did this previously, but let's finish this paragraph. Commanders are meant to have names, traits, and faces so you can remember them, and if you have too many of them, you can tell them apart. But limiting the number of how many of them you can maintain simultaneously restricts your ability to fine-tune your military and control who goes where, which can be frustrating, especially when you have to assign generals to an indeterminate number of fronts. I have insanely strong opinions on this entire paragraph, and that is because the old system And we talked about this. I mean, we talked about this for so long, okay? But here's my biggest problems when it comes to what we saw after launch. Before launch, we already talked about the issue of it's really weird that we automatically assign stuff. I saw the reasoning back then as, well, if you don't do it automatically and you have a revolution brewing, you can very easily take away troops from a general that otherwise would have power and would strengthen the revolution. I saw that reasoning, but it was still so weird that the field marshal would be like, I always have 100 troops, no negotiation. It doesn't make any sense. Oh, well, he always has a claim to 100 troops. Where I'm coming from here is that in its own right was weird. But the military in itself, I'm telling you this and you all will go, oh my god, that is true. The way the human player plays with the military and the generals and admirals in particular right now, even if you're not trying to exploit it, what the most organic style of play is counter to anything that system stands for, and means that you have never experienced what the political system in Victoria 3 should actually be looking like. Where am I coming from here? When you tab into an AI country in Victoria 3, you will find a very finely tuned selection of generals and admirals in control of troops, and they're always there. When one goes away, they recruit another one, and so on. If you look at players, they will have maybe 4 people, and they're all field marshals. They all have 100 troops, or whatever the maximum of your fleet is, okay? No player goes through the trouble of being like, let's have several that have 20 troops, let's have several that have 40 troops, several that have 60, and so on and so forth. But that is detrimental to the political experience, because clearly, when you design a political system that allows for generals and admirals directly giving a buff to their respective IG, depending on their rank, you all of a sudden run into an issue when somebody doesn't utilize this, where that whole thing falls apart. The landowners in a peasant levy situation are meant to be insanely strong, because you're meant to assign them to their troops, but you can just not do that. You can just not have landowner generals and admirals, which means they don't get any percentage boost, okay? You can have armed forces be insanely strong, but realistically, listen, when I play Germany, for example, I maybe have 3 commanders, right? I have maybe 4. I have 2 fleets maybe, and then 2 generals that generally advance stuff, and then in a panic, whenever I see frontline splitting, I will recruit more. But what that means is that my entire political spectrum is completely out of whack. I am not a fan at all of how generals and admirals were implemented with the percentage bonuses, just because if you ever do not act this way, and I know there's an exploit as well where you just hire 1 million of the same IG and strengthen the IG into the heavens with this, but the opposite, even if you don't want to play exploity, is so much more common, because that's the natural style of playing. Why would I recruit 1 million different faces if I'm not planning on going to war anytime soon? Where I'm coming from here is that I think the focus on generals and admirals fundamentally was wrong. We talked about this pre-release, at least that it was troubled, but I think with hindsight, after playing, it was fundamentally wrong. I don't think we should focus on the individuals at all. I think the Victorian era has a really, really cool military design, because we start with a fairly unorganized, non-doctrinal approach to warfare. Obviously, they have doctrines, don't get me wrong here, but we then end up with stuff like the OKB, for example, the OHL, so everything that has to do with the order of battle, and becomes much more systemic, much more sort of systemized, right? It's all about the idea, the concept, the structure of the army behind it, rather than individual commanders and what they do. I would love a system where instead, very early on, yes, we do focus on generals, yes, we do focus on admirals, but they just literally do not matter later on, because your actual structure, your military academy, your OOB, all that stuff comes in and actually takes over. The structure, the doctrinal implementation from things. But listen, that takes it away too far. Where I'm coming from here is that I think the way this is implemented has been super detrimental, and 0% of you have ever experienced the actual political balancing of this game, because you should have been recruiting all these generals much like the AI does, because otherwise your groups, your IGs, aren't getting the bonuses that they're meant to get, and yeah, not a big fan at all. So moving this away from generals and admirals actually being what houses an army into military formations, huge good step. I hope that they expand further into this, because yeah, I'm super unhappy with the way it is right now. Just on a purely mechanical level, I think it has way too many weaknesses. It's just not good enough. Let's say we put gameplay over narrative concerns about identity uniqueness and remove the cap. Then we run into the issue of having to give every one of them a unique order every time we want them to go somewhere. I hate that. We have to do that currently, or do something different. This is very annoying when you just want everyone to go defend your single front line. Who hasn't dealt with that? To make things worse, if one of them kicks the bucket due to old age or gets suddenly ripped away due to some special event, your entire military campaign might be irrevocably disrupted in an instant. Well, we made an initial pass to address the issue in 1.3 with field promotions of new commanders. Having a non-character container for your armed forces removes the problem altogether. Your units will remain in place, and you can resign or recruit a new commander to lead them as you wish. Another issue with the current system is that buildings act as your main vector for customizing your military. While this makes sense to model the economic and population impact your armed forces have, it can be cumbersome and unintuitive of constructing a diverse and capable military. Military formations tackles the issue of commanders being simultaneously too static and too ephemeral by providing a container for both commanders, generals or admirals depending on formation type, as well as combat units, battalions and flotillas. You can create as many formations as you want, with or without commanders, each with as many commanders as you like, and you can move both units and commanders between formations at will. The design intent here is to provide you with a kind of entity, that's programmers speak of for thingamajig, that is more customizable to your own needs for agency than commanders are. These needs may vary a lot depending on what kind of country you're playing, where in the world you are, and what kind of wars you happen to get yourself into. It also gives us a better platform for customization, adding depth, than commanders and buildings are, which we will see below. And finally, facets we're including with formations such as concrete movement and unit types give us a lot more opportunities to visually represent your military on the map and in the UI. So let's get into some more details. Before we do this, let me finish the topic of commanders and admirals. I believe what it should be like is that military formations, depending on their size and the complexity of production methods that they have, should require a certain amount of commanders. Okay? So that instead of me just saying, boom, 100, this guy can have a control of 100, put him in there. Instead of that being the case, instead of me saying, oh, this military formation has 100 troops and 15 generals, compared to this military formation has 100 troops and 1 general, 100 troops should have a need for a certain amount and rank system of commanders, so that we get a soft order of battle within military formations. We could even go further and say that military formations, if they are in the same theater, should also require an even bigger order of battle above them. But for the moment, I would fundamentally say generals and commanders should get a role where it says if you are on line infantry, super basic stuff, you need 3 commanders for 100 troops. So there, I'm just making this up, right? Don't take this for granted. Always, obviously, a highest commander, that would be the ideal, but then let's say that highest commander has 2 underlings. That is how you get the maximum performance out of this military formation. Whereas if you run a troop that has, let's say, 100 troops, but they all use trench warfare, they have planes, for example, all of a sudden, let's be, a bit radical about this, you need 11 commanders. It's 1 highest commander, then 10 underneath, right? 1 per 10 units. I am bringing this up in this fashion because, again, the systemic approach to warfare took over in this period. Commanders in 1836 are not the same commanders as in 1914 and 1918. Being of the same rank in different periods had different roles with how autark you were, with how individualistic your commands and your actual approach to warfare would be. And this is super important. I do not believe at all in commanders and their rank naturally giving IG cloud bonuses. I think it sucks. I think it's really bad. I think instead, commanders, the military formation should spit out IG cloud bonuses. If we're gonna have cloud bonuses at all, that is, okay? I think that is how it should work. A very powerful military formation in Germany, in my core territory, that is in control of the most advanced power, that is the most decorated military formation in the entire empire, should spit out more IG cloud for the IG of the commanders, and that should then go in there, than the cloud of field marshals sitting in Central Africa. I hope you get where I'm coming from there. I would like that to be moved away from the commander layer. Yes, still connected to it. Whoever the commanders support should get then a fraction of that cloud, but the cloud should overall be determined in the military formation overall. How great is its military formation? What is going on there? How big is it? What is actually happening? And beyond that, I do again believe that military ranks should actually just basically be an evolving fashion, because that is what it is. And we're going to get to that even later. I have a lot to say about OOBs, okay? That's all I'm saying. Anyway, that is my approach to generals and admirals. After playing, I'm very much opposed to the idea of actually tying directly power to them as characters, because you will and you ought to have a mass of characters as you go into mass warfare. It's a huge shift in how things work. Now, let's talk about the specifics of military formations, though. This is gonna be the longest video I think I uploaded this year. Combat unit types. In addition to recruiting commanders into military formations, which works similarly to how it currently does in the live version, you can also recruit specific unit types and mix and match to your heart's desire. If you're playing a single state country and want to recruit 5 skirmish and 10 line infantry, you cannot do so in the current version of the game, since one unit type is governed by production method and all levels of a building must have the same methods. So if you are, for example, just, who is a one province minor? Baden. If you're Baden, you can only have one type of infantry. That is the way it is. It really sucks. Right now, as I understand it, with the new system, you would be building 15 levels of barracks, and what those barracks are actually doing is determined, instead of in the barracks, in the military formation. So you can now customize and specialize. In 1.5, you can do just that in a formation, and the barracks that get constructed around those units, as a result, will maintain the mix. This works by creating the units inside of the scope of the military formation itself, not by expanding buildings directly. That allows our UX design vision for this feature. Rather than configuring and maintaining your military through an awkward mix of interactions with buildings and characters, all interactions with your military are done through formations first and foremost, with characters and buildings appearing around the formations as supporting entities to ensure existing game mechanics continue to function. In addition to the different types of infantry units, we are also adding additional groups of units with different properties: infantry, artillery and cavalry on the army side, as well as light ships, capital ships and support ships for the navy. We are now specializing this, and I'm super happy with what is coming for the navy. It's not quite there yet where I would like to see it, but it's so much better. For the final release, most or all of these will have unique illustrations, icons, and right now they all have the same placeholder icon, completely fine. So let's take a look at this. This is the container military formation. First, Spanish army. Information, mobilization, modifiers. We're going to get to mobilization later. The modifier page is just a long list of modifiers. I detest that page, but don't worry about it. And then here you can see how many units are in here in general. Then here we can see, I believe, the attrition and morale. And then this is the upkeep cost as it currently stands. We got line infantry, that is the vast majority of this military formation. We got mobile artillery, we got cannon artillery, and we have mobile artillery as well. So these are the support units, I guess, and this right here is indeed the general infantry unit as is. And then right here, you would also specialize. You would build more of this unit type, and of course it would then determine where to build this, but those barracks would then be configured again within the military formation. Units constructed in this way will be upgradable between types, though not for the first open beta release, but only in certain cases. You will be able to upgrade your ship of the line to ironclads, as well as often done historically, but you cannot upgrade your ironclads to a different ship class like battleships. We're very interested in hearing your feedback, the specific units we're adding into the open beta, how they're grouped and balanced, and how managing them in the UI feels. Yeah, if we take a look at this right here, what we can see, I wish this was indented a little bit here, I guess, but basically this artillery is, we have total 5 pieces of artillery, 4 of which are still cannon artillery, and then 1 of which is mobile artillery, building 2 more as well. And then here, all of these infantry pieces are actually line infantry. A total, of course, 73 plus 5 makes 78. So we got the different types, we got infantry, artillery, cavalry, and so on, and that can of course be configured as well. Appears to be very, very scriptable. Now let's talk about combat unit types in general. I think this is the right step. Again, containing these troops inside of a military unit in the military formations makes a lot of sense. It also lets you build a lot of stuff on top of this, which isn't necessarily all in yet, but looks very interesting and much, much more promising right there. Again, you build all of this through one proper interface, looking at a general and then upgrading their stuff through those barracks, and potentially those barracks actually also having the troops of another general, which means you just upgraded their troops. Super cumbersome, never liked it. I don't think anybody's ever liked that. This is way, way better. I think the interface, again, maybe indent this stuff, that sort of stuff, but I think this interface in general is one of the better ones for sure. On top of all of that, of course, I will also say that I like it a whole lot better that we are looking at ships actually now having vessels. Super important stuff. How pronounced vessels actually is, I'm curious about, because they don't really go into the details right here, but in the future, I mean, vessels are like a prime thing in my opinion of having naval warfare and the cost of the naval arms race represented in Victoria 3. It seems to be much more viable to integrate this right now. Naval units are just barracks, but on the sea in Victoria 3, that really sucks, but that is going away. We now will have vessels. Big fan of that as well, for sure. Earmark all of these things, by the way, because I have an overarching take on something that I feel is missing. Despite all of these things being really good changes, I will come back to all of these things, basically, when we talk about that particular overarching thing. And with that being said, let's move on to mobilization options. I've always been happy with the current mobilization mechanics in theory than in practice. I like the increased demand on my industry during wartime and how that changes my economy and my pop's economy. I also appreciate that I cannot cheese the game by cranking down my consumption of military goods to 0 in peacetime and turn it up to max when I'm at war. And that increased consumption is handled automatically as I mobilize a general into activity. I enjoy the tough decisions sometimes I have to make about whether I can truly afford to mobilize another general or if my currently mobilized force should be able to mop up the opposition in time. What I do not like about it is how hard it is to balance both as a designer and player, since it only increases the quantity of goods they are already consuming and therefore can only do so in a quantity that doesn't cause immediate shortages in your economy. Having to maintain mandatory unprofitable import routes for guns and ammo with potential elasticity to ensure I can prosecute my future wars sounds cool but can feel a bit much in practice sometimes. Mobilization options permit you to customize what goods you want to give your battalions when they are out active soldiering, with powerful effects providing trade-offs for the increased costs. Sometimes those goods are military hardware, other times they are just better rations or fancy uniforms. Adding consumer costs as a possible cost to mobilization also means a stronger impact on the civilian population during the war effort, which is both realistic and a great game dynamic. Big fan of that for sure. Making them actually consume stuff that consumers also consume, good step. Doubtlessly, a very excellent step. Mobilization options typically impose a cost in goods per unit in a formation which is applied to that unit's building in exchange for an effect on all units. Both cost and effect are applied only when mobilized, and mobilization options can be toggled on or off only while the formation is demobilized. This right here is the list of mobilization options that they will launch with the initial open beta release, fully unlocked of course. But it is neither finalized nor well balanced. Some of the options may even end up as new unit types instead, or in addition to, for example. We will be actively seeking feedback on what other options you want to see, and rework the UI to allow us to fit more options. Icons are currently borrowed from other armies of the game and are particularly work in progress. Alright, areas of the game, sorry. Mobilization options don't have to be just about goods. It can also just be toggles on how you want this formation to behave. For example, forced march causes the formation to move faster, but at a cost of increased morale loss. A penalty which could be countered by luxurious supplies if desired. Rail transport is mutually exclusive with forced march, doesn't cause morale loss, but requires both the railway tech and transportation goods. The way we see mobilization options used is as toggles that can be set prior to active warfare, taking properties like market conditions, commander traits, and combat unit mix into account. You could customize a small fast formation of elite crack troops or a giant army of cheap irregulars forced to march on an empty stomach, depending on your strengths as a nation and who you're likely to be fighting against. I like mobilization options more in theory than I like them in practice. So this basically comes instead, or as an adjustment to the secondary production methods that we already had, right? Flamethrowers, chemical weapons, machine gunners, those may seem very familiar to you. I think that is good, making them on-off toggles in general. I think, by the way, this interface is really hideous. I wish they did like square buttons or something else. You know, like selection button. This is just, I hate it. But listen, that's not really what matters. Where I'm coming from when I say that I dislike this is thinking of these options as things you determine pre-mobilization. I think that's a huge mistake, and I think it doesn't make any sense. I also think that the way secondary PMs work in the current release version already is a bit of a mistake, where basically you are encouraged to not change it unless you are not at war, because it will be like a really hefty modifier that you get as a negative. When that is just not how this works in most of the conflicts. Now, if you had, which is currently not really viable in Victoria 3, but if you had a really prolonged bloody war like World War I or any other, I mean, even the Crimean War actually saw like some changes there. There's a lot of different complex conflicts, right? But where I'm coming from here is, I think it's a mistake to say, if I have a prolonged war in the Pacific, I need to say these troops come home, demobilize, change your mobilization option, and then you go. I don't even, just for the record, changing this does not seem to incur any penalty on the strength, right? So if I activate flamethrowers, it just makes this army better. Now, I do have a downtime because I need to recall them, then activate flamethrowers, then send them back out again. As I understand it right now, these options do not require an acclimatization period where you say we need to get used to these new things, we don't properly understand them. Now, again, this period appears to be kind of inside already implemented by simply saying, all right, well, you have the downtime, you need to recall your army, you need to re-equip them and then mobilize them again, and that is your downtime. But I think that fundamentally gets this wrong. I think as it stands, mobilization options are good for customization, and they are essentially many secondary production methods that you can add onto and that you can then see the total effect of right here. Although, again, I do kind of really hate this interface, do not love it. But where I'm coming from here is, I think mobilization options get the idea of using specific parts of warfare wrong. If I were to have a war where we are stuck in the trenches and my scientists come up and say, we have now flamethrowers, you would hardly suggest that every unit that wants to use flamethrowers needs to be demobilized, get flamethrowers, and then return to the front line. Obviously, you train troops behind the front lines, but this is a revolving door, right? This is an absolute revolving door, where the unit that these new units get trained for, unless it's entirely new units, rarely just leave the front behind. What I foresee this to lead to is adding a really weird revolving door system where you have more military formations than you are actually sending to the front, and then you train them up to have a new tech, and then you send them to the front and retire the old ones, and maybe give them a new equipment as well. I find this weird from the sole view of the concept. It's like you are adding busy work where it doesn't need to be with this. Because if I change the equipment of a mobilized troop, if I activate flamethrowers, they should simply have an upticking thing of how well can I handle this new equipment? How well am I versed in these new abilities, in this new technology? And that ticks up, which means that you already have a downtime because you get initially a 0 bonus out of this until you actually learn how to properly utilize it. I am not sold on the idea of these mobilization options being something that you activate when they're demobilized. Now, we can't tell exactly anyway, and I want to have the benefit of the doubt here. We can't tell whether changing something like this here makes it so that initially, if you activate it and then one day later go to war with it, whether that will be optimal performance of these flamethrowers or not. Right now, I cannot see that, we have a re-gearing sort of penalty attached to our units. We might have, but I can't see it at the very least. And where I'm coming from here is that I think that is a huge missed opportunity in how these mobilization options should interact with your generals and with your military formations. I'm going to come back to this at the very end, because that is my biggest point about this whole thing, in how these military formations could benefit from experience and from doctrinal knowledge, right? So let's move on for now. But my opinion here is I really love more options. I'm not a fan of the way this is implemented, where you need to be demobilized and I potentially have to rotate in and out troops, which again is ultimately just really busy work. But let's put all of that aside for the moment by talking about early mobilization. While we initially added early demobilization with 1.3.6, it was a little bit hacky. It operated as a character interaction rather than a military command, and only applied a flat cost to a country in response to the goods cost prior to demobilization, instead of incurring actual consumption. We have now made it possible to demobilize armies during active warfare if desired. When this happens, the army will first have to travel home, and will then spend 4 months in demobilization, exact value very much subject to feedback, where mobilization supply cost will be gradually decreased over the duration. Unlike the current live implementation on generals, these goods will be properly consumed in the interim, so your industries and trade routes don't immediately collapse with nothing to gain for it. Early demobilization can also be a little more relevant in the open beta due to mobilization options, in case those options you provided ended up a little too costly over the course of the war, and you want to return home for reconfiguration. I hate this. I think this sucks. Don't like it. Mobilize army. First Brazilian army is still demobilizing for 116 additional days. Mobilizing an army will immediately begin the process of mobilization for all battalions assigned to it. A mobilized army will automatically stand down once the country is no longer at war. Early demobilization while in active warfare is possible, but takes time and a substantial cost. Early demobilization being reformed into a full-on military activity, good stuff. Nothing wrong with it, I just don't like the idea of doing it so that I can send them back to the front. It's like, my god, that's really weird to me. Let's talk about stationing at HQ. That is something really good right here. Military formations, both armies and fleets, are initially created in an HQ but do not need to stay there. Thank God. You can restation a military formation at an HQ, even a temporary one you have established during the course of the war on Allied or occupied territory, if you're willing to pay the increased supply cost for doing so, depending on where your combat units are actually from, once we get around to adding that increased supply cost that is. Until then, restation away. You can station a fleet in any coastal HQ. Later during the open beta, we will require an active naval base to exist in order to station your fleet there. This is the big thing, right? Naval bases and how many ships they could viably support at any given time were a huge consideration for where imperialistic powers would claim land. The way, colonization currently works in Victoria 3 doesn't really reflect this, but there are particular strategic papers. Those are the ones that I read anyway. I'm sure that the other Royal Navy and so on also had these papers. But there were particular strategic papers coming from the German Empire's Navy where they were discussing the viability of opposing the Royal Navy, for example, or the French Navy in African waters. And they came to the conclusion that the local ports, the local naval dockyards that the British and the French had in the region were so far superior in their simple geographical reality and in how they had been built up over the years and decades that defense outside of simply literally trying to defend the German homeland was utterly impossible. Obviously, they also all bought into the fleet and being strategy, more on that in a later video, but basically the idea here is choosing where you can station your fleet determines how big your fleet can be, how well you can supply it, determines how well you can fight it, how defensible your structure is. And I think all of that is crazy important and shouldn't just be like, you need it to be stationed there. This is a really good step, don't get me wrong here. But long term, I really need this to be like a massive strategic consideration, as it was historically. Fundamentally, this screen, I absolutely love it. I love the fact you got real travel time right now. It's no longer all, 30 or 60 days. Nope, it actually is. If you have your fleet in London and you threaten Japan, hey, listen, it's gonna take you ages to actually get there. Why should I be afraid if your troops aren't there? I like this, really cool. Stationing these in different locations as well is going to be important as well, of course, as soon as navies have actual ranges, so that your London-based location can't execute a mission right down here in Cape Colony. No. For that, you should have a local station right here in Cape Colony. That is viable now, with military formations being able to be stationed. This also means if you want to move an army to proactively defend against an impending naval invasion, you can do so, as long as you are quick about it. HQ interaction. I hope that interception is a thing, but yeah, beyond that, I love the travel times, I love all that stuff. And now let's talk about something that I am massively positive about, and I think that should have been a main consideration from the start. I think it's so good. We talked about this at the very start, where visuals and the feeling about things can often mean more than the actual underlying mechanics, and I think this is a huge part of this. Concrete locations. Another thing that we have been dissatisfied with is the lack of a tangible location for your armed forces. In the current live versions, generals and admirals are either at the HQ they recruited into or on a mission somewhere, depending on their current order. But when a commander moves somewhere in response to their order changing, they are put into a kind of limbo, while they are moving to a new location. Typically a front, with naval movement being more abstracted as an execution time, and with the travel time only visualized as a countdown in the UI. In the open beta, formations will always have a concrete on-map location, so you can track their real-time movement between locations more easily. Generals and admirals no longer have their own independent locations, as this is inferred by their formations, but generals can autonomously spread out across fronts to visually indicate what state they are primarily defending and or attacking. So I would argue, just for the record, the actual generals being located somewhere is really primarily, if not only, visual, but obviously the military formation being somewhere is literally the way it is. You can see this right here. For the first open beta release, movement will be tracked only in straight lines. Here we see an army moving first from the Maranhão-Pará front, then towards the Maranhão-Rio Grande do Sul front, and finally back towards its HQ in Rio de Janeiro when it is demobilized. Bolivia declared rivalry. Thank God. Thank God. This means that interception, this means that navy movement, this means that movement along more difficult terrain will now actually all be occurring. Look at this. Look at him go. Look at him having a good time. I like the UI as well, by the way. You see how many days more it is. You see how many troops there are. I like the UI here. I am surprised to say this right now, but I like the UI of what is going on right here. And I think all in all, this is a really, really good implementation. We can see one of the battles right here, by the way, where it happens far beyond, behind the front. This is, of course, because, well, this entire front line right here basically is for this state. Piratini is trying to push north, and that battle is happening behind the front, and you can then occupy a certain percentage. Concrete location is one of the most important features, because concrete locations should be what determines how defendable your empire actually is. Where I'm coming from here is that the military, in particular, in the UK, was as successful as it was because it has a general global reach, a worldwide hegemony. They had stations in Cape Colony, they had stations right here, they had stations right here, they had stations right there. They had stations, of course, in the home counties, they had stations right here in the Mediterranean. And this mattered. Moving vessels from one station to another was a massive, massive deal back in the day. It still is today. But it also explains why, fundamentally, the British Empire was so unquestionable, the hegemonial power of the world at the time, because they truly had global reach. Right now, I can say, hey, Japan, open your market. And oh my God, we set this pre-release as well. But Japan, open your market. And Japan looks at my Navy number season 800 and says, I am dying. If Japan looked at my Navy number and saw 20 ships close to them and the rest was nowhere near, Japan might say, who the hell are you? Obviously, you can still win. Don't get me wrong here. Britain could historically absolutely dismantle the Japanese fleet there in that context. But where I'm coming from here is local fighting, local theaters, local warfare is not viable unless you have concrete locations. The German Navy cannot defend in Africa because it's sitting in port in Hamburg und Bremen, and it is being basically barricaded, blockaded by the British Royal Navy. This was a huge deal, by the way, just for the record. The German Navy, as I said in the papers, was discussing the possibility of defending basically in the Atlantic and said it's utterly impossible. Do not even think about it. The only viable port city that we could utilize as an actual main base of operation during war would be Tsingtao, which they ultimately didn't do because they built, they bought into the idea of fleet in being, which means you want to concentrate your powers and then strike for one decisive battle. All of these forces, all of these terms, if you played Hearts of Iron 4, should be familiar for you. And then you are free to do whatever you want, but you need to establish hegemony on the sea. That is why they concentrated all their powers in Hamburg to bind the Royal Navy, and it worked, just for the record, it worked. The attacks on Royal Navy ships with submarines were only as viable as they were because the Royal Navy said we can't help those actual trade ships because, well, we need to be ready, concentrated fleet in being, to get rid of the German Navy, and then we can disperse. When in 1917, before the German Navy was actually really taken out, when they started to assign convoys to actual trading ships, the entire submarine warfare of the Germans fell apart in World War I. Where I'm coming from here is concrete location matters. It matters a ton. And the Atlantic pivot, or well, the home fleet pivot that the British fleet, for example, did before World War I, between 1900 and 1914, where they shifted all of their vessels towards the home counties fleet in the British Isles, that was a massive, massive ordeal that required a lot of logistics and a lot of technical and doctrinal know-how. And that was only viable because they were a global empire. Again, I cannot overstate, and I think I've seen it understated the entire time, I cannot overstate how important to get warfare right at any point going forward concrete locations actually are for this system. This means that it matters where my vessels are. This means it matters where I can execute my missions. This means it matters how fast I can be somewhere, how well supplied I can be somewhere, how well experienced I can be somewhere. Super important stuff. And we're going to come back to that as well when I want to discuss the whole thing, how I view the future of military formations and what they should be instead of what they are right now. Because as positive as I am about them, as much as I love them compared to what we have right now, there's so much more that can be done. Concrete location, amazing, amazing stuff. I'm really looking forward to this. You can see it right here. Currently, it is just in linear movements. It will be following the spline network. For upcoming open beta releases, formations will pathfind across roads, railways, and sea lanes, or sea lanes only for fleets for obvious reasons, and travel along those to their destination. Here we see the path taken by an army traveling from Örebro, Sweden, to Tampa, Florida. The short skip over English territory visualized here is because the Pathfinder currently does not take either military access or spline travel time into account, but just travel length. Once we've completed our work on the Pathfinder, it should still be possible for armies to disembark, traverse, land, re-embark, if the time savings make it worth it, but it will generally be avoided. So you can see this right here, super cool map, absolutely love it. We're going from right here, boom, that is where the army travels, that is what is going on there, and that is what it's calculating right here, all the way to Tampa, Florida, where you probably don't want to go, but this is cool. What this also necessitates is basically pointing out, do not go through these C nodes. I think that will be vital. Hearts of Iron 4 already does it with their C zones, which basically are C nodes, where you can say, don't go there, it's hazardous, do not do it. I think that is important long term. I also think that this will be absolutely beneficial when it comes to actual blockades. I was thinking about a naval system, and I will make that video, I swear to God, but I was thinking about a naval system, and there was a problem with how you actually do blockades, because it was always would always interfere with other ports. For example, if you blockade this right here, right, how do you guarantee that trade routes can't just start here and then go through here? There should just be toggles. You should just be able to get a toggle there. Don't worry about the details there. But where I'm coming from here is concrete location, spline network travel for trade, for armies, for fleets. We need it. We're getting it. Huge fan. This is a massive, massive improvement right here that can be felt no matter how anything else is implemented. That is my opinion. I think concrete location is one of the most overlooked things. It's massive to actually deal with needing to establish a global empire, because the Germans never managed to do it. The Germans never had global reach the same way that, for example, the British did. The United States of America considered this very specifically as well. When they were thinking about... when Mayen was thinking about a potential war against the British, what they were suggesting is, listen, the British are going to start trying to blockade our coast and primarily have to blockade where our main fleet is. We're going to keep this fleet in New York. Should they ever leave to actually blockade our entire coast, which would of course interfere with our trade, we will go and simply raid every coaling station right here, every base that they have, making it so that they lose their global reach. If Canada's coaling stations are disabled, the British cannot operate right here. Right now, that is not the case. Right now, where you are doesn't matter, right? Concrete location makes this type of gameplay viable. All of a sudden. Huge fan. Naval operations in particular need to be super station-bound, I think, in the future. I don't think they are yet, but I think they have to in the future. Anyway, let's move on. Transferring commanders and units between formations. Of course, there will be moments where you would like to split, merge, or transfer commanders and units between two formations of the same type, even with shared fronts and state-based occupation. There may be instances where a new front is created in an area where you are already having an army. For example, if you join a totally separate war, while you already have another military engagement. This can be easily done in the field if you have a single formation with multiple commanders. You can right-click one of those commanders and choose to split it off into a new formation, which will cause them to quickly take a number of representative units in proportion to their own command limit and form a new formation with the same properties and in the same place. You can tune this more precisely if you like by opening a transfer pop-up, where you can select the exact commanders and units you want to move, select the target formation, which could be a brand new one, and execute the transfer. If the target formation is not in the same location as the origin, a temporary formation will be created that automatically travels to the destination, where it will automatically merge with the target. In-game mockups of what the transfer pop-up will look like. We're hard at work to try and get this implemented for the first open beta release, but it might not be fully functional until the second release in September. We're also considering other potential enhancements to this, such as double-sided panel, where you can transfer commanders and units back and forth between two formations. Cool stuff. This is great. This is really good. I think even the UI, I'm a pest, I think, when it comes to UI wishes, but I think all in all, this is a good idea that can also build on other stuff that I'm going to mention at the end. Okay, very important. But yeah, no, you can split your units, you can take units, commanders, and the settings of those formations also are transferred. You can transfer very particular units and so on and so forth. And again, I do just want to say here, I see this exploit again here, where you would just transfer demobilized troops into the mobilized units and to get new mobilization options, and I'm not a fan of that at all. Listen, it is what it is. I hope that they change it over the course of the beta. Let's talk about name and icon customization. When a formation is first created, it gets a name selected based on your primary culture, type, and how many other formations you have of that type. You can change that name to your liking, to help you remember what you've designed it for, just for flavor and immersion. In subsequent releases of the open beta, you will also be able to customize the symbol and color of the formation icon, making it even easier to identify which formation is traveling across the map or deploys across a front. A very work-in-progress screenshot of the formation appearance customization pop-up. The pattern section will provide a list of possible unique icons, while the color section will contain a palette suitable for the formation type. I wish this was a full, like a color wheel, a full thing, but hey, this is like Stellaris. I would suffer through it. CK3 got a color wheel, I'm just saying, okay? You gotta compete with CK3. Anyway, I like this, nothing wrong with this, customizing it. It's a cool thing, it's very memorable, and I think it really plays into something. If you want to basically have very specific formations, be very glorious, I would even love it if it tracked what conflicts any formation participated in, but that might be a bit too much. I don't think it matters. I do think formation customization and why tradition matters is something for my last point again, but we're going to get to that. Revised naval invasions. I'm super happy with this because naval invasions were a huge pain, huge exploit heaven. That is gone. Naval invasions have also been revised to accommodate the new state-based occupation mechanics and improve the UX in managing naval invasions. Naval invasions can be initiated either from a formation or the military lens. Like in the current version of the game, you target a state, but as a follow-up step, you then get the option to add the formations to be involved in the invasion. During the open beta, we will enhance this panel with more information to help inform you on the likelihood of success, such as exposing information about landing penalties and the like. As you confirm the naval invasion, the formation selected will travel to the sea node just off the coast of the targeted state. When they have both arrived, landing battles will commence. A proper front with armies assigned to that front will not be created until the state is fully occupied. When this happens, the naval invasion has been concluded. In the interim, the supporting fleet may be attacked by enemy fleets. If any of these naval battles are lost, the naval invasion will fail and both formations will return home. If a naval battle is won, but heavy ship casualties are taken, landing battles will take higher penalties until the fleet can be reinforced. During the open beta, we will also look into adding more formations to a naval invasion already in progress. Aside from closing some exploits relating to war exhaustion, this revision will make naval invasion as much more serious affair that requires naval dominance. We will be actively seeking feedback during the open beta to ensuring executing and defending against naval invasions is more fun and interesting rather than it is in the currently live version. Exploits are gone. Much more manageable to intercept a naval invasion and much more manageable to basically do a naval invasion. If you know you have hegemony over the seas, it will be easy. The front line, again, is created as soon as you 100% occupy whatever state you're invading, which then makes it strategic to pick the right state as well. And once that is done, you have a regular front line, you have a regular situation going on right there. I think this is a really, really good approach. Should be solid going forward. I don't really see... I don't really think I see any negatives. I think this is a big, big upgrade. Now let's talk about Frontline Graphics. While most of the graphical enhancements will be appearing across the open beta's periods to updates, we already have a first iteration of Frontline Graphics functional in the current development build. You see this right here. Instead of just one graphic popping up per battle, you will now have this. Now all of this still looks pretty boring because it's the original graphics, right, which are basically, there's nothing living in them. It's just machinery, it's just huts, it's just buildings, trenches, and so on. But you can see there's much more action. You can see it on the map as well. And then Frontline Graphics will represent the current formations at the front, with models being selected based on unit type, culture, tech, and mobilization options active. Specific formations and even specific generals will have a distinct location on the front line, with their units organized in their vicinity. Concept art of our visual target for the final Frontline Graphics. One of these dioramas will be assembled dynamically based on formation composition and placed in each province along the front, possibly with some provinces omitted if the front is particularly long and the formations particularly small, to avoid miscommunication about the size of an army. I love this. We all know and love the big man running around on the map. What this is right here, if executed right, and so far I gotta say, I really love the art department of Victoria 3. I think the Voice of the People art was amazing, really beautiful stuff. If they get that in here as well, where, you have certain segments, it's much like this sort of, what do you call it, this puzzle that you would build up in, for example, if you build a city in Paris, right? If you build a certain building, it pops up right there. If you demolish a building, it disappears. And right here, if you have mobile artillery, you should see mobile artillery. If you have siege artillery, in that same spot, you could see siege artillery. You make it modular, and with that, fairly easy to work with, fairly easy to reiterate on it. You have this if you have skirmish infantry, you have a trench here if you have trench infantry, but it's the same spot, it's the same location where you can place it. You have a very particular rifle here. Here you could have a machine gun if you had machine gunning, right? That sort of stuff. I really like this approach because it shows every element instead of one big man, one big cannon. I love that. I really, really adore this. I am worried about performance. It's already very difficult to zoom in when you are in the end game, when you look around yourself and you see infinite cities plastered all over the world and your computer says, please, I want to die. I hope that they can deal with that, but performance is, whether it's graphical or actually CPU performance, something that will impact your experience if you play Victoria 3, no matter what. Now, with that out of the way, but I want to sort of just skim over this because I don't think it is too relevant for now. Yes, there will be drawbacks in the open beta for sure. Basically, they also broke a couple of things because new mechanics don't correctly interact with these old mechanics yet, and that needs to be addressed. For example, right now, conscription is broken because, well, the way military formations work just doesn't really vibe with conscription. Then, naval warfare is currently something that is also broken because the naval invasions are fixed, but the other way, the way range works, the way C node and that sort of stuff works, that's not really in yet. I'm a big fan of fleet range being introduced at some point. Real fleet range, hopefully. Limited fog of war being introduced later as well. Really big fan. UI alerts and some manner of fleet automation like patrol routes. Huge fan. Although I'm not sure that they have the right focus there, but hey, let's not get lost in the tea there. Again, I do want to make a... I'm gonna work on that tomorrow, okay? I'm gonna make a video just focused on naval warfare changes as I would like to see them. I have it all written down already. I just need to actually create the graphics in full. It's all done. Anyway, these are the changes coming. Obviously, again, these things are broken in the initial beta release. They will be fixed throughout the beta, and these are the big changes that are being made in 1.5 Warfare. Now, I want to bring up one huge thing before we go into the developer responses, and that is addressing the role generals and admirals play, the role military formations play, and the way mobilization options interact with all of it, okay? Because I think this is really important. So, ideally, long term, to re-express this wish, I would like to see general order of battle structures within a military formation. Let me get out paint. Now, I do want to highlight one thing, and that is the simple fact that I don't think that any of this is actually going to make it into the game in the open beta or even afterwards. Let's say that the things that I'm saying here are good ideas that may very well be true, but actually implementing them will cost a whole lot more in resources, and more importantly, it is something that doesn't really fit the bill of the open beta because, well, it goes a bit further than anything that you might be able to suggest there. Nonetheless, I want to talk about it because that is what we have always done on this channel. We have suggested things, we have discussed very elaborate systems. I'm going to do that again with the Navy video going forward, and I think that this is the most important takeaway for me. Now, if you're wondering why am I doing this, because this is not going to be pretty, I'm doing this because I think at least a tiny bit of visualization, even if it's not all that great, is better than no visualization. So, let's start by discussing what is going on with characters in military formations and what I would like it to look like. Right now, when you have a military formation, from what I understand it at the very least, you can basically recruit generals as much as you want. Obviously, they're going to split their troops. So, for example, if I have 200 troops in a military formation, right, and then I have a field marshal in here, that field marshal will take 100. So this is character A, he has 100 troops underneath them, and that is what he does. When he goes into battle, when he does certain things, 100 troops get his bonuses right there. Then we have character B. Let's say character B gets 60 troops. There you go. All of this, of course, happens in the same military formation, so this is how that event happens if such a military formation has 200 units within it. And then, last but not least, we have the weakest of them, that is character C, who then has 40 troops underneath them. These representations are the way it currently works, right? Currently, it is directly tied to the general and to the admirals, whatever is going on there. But then they all stand side by side and they fight in these battles. Maybe they borrow troops out to other characters, but fundamentally, they are separate. They are their own thing. Now, of course, in the new system, they are connected via military formations. For example, I would assign them to the front that I mentioned previously with us, Prussia, and the enemy Austria, and I send them towards, for example, Bohemia. If I say, hey, the strategic target here is Bohemia, please attack there, then it will roll and will say one of these three is going to go and actually assault in Bohemia. If they can, obviously, they may take more troops, you know, than what is going on in their own bubble. So, for example, the one with 40 as a command here would maybe say, hey, we have enough troops at this front line that I can use 100 troops, and then he borrows troops from the other people. My hope is that this system will totally change. I do not at all like the idea that we can just willy-nilly create more people within a military formation, split up those troops in there. I just don't see the purpose. And most importantly, and this is a major focus for me, as I said previously, I am super bothered by just how this impacts the actual political internal gameplay. Again, we aren't really playing the way it was meant to be done, unless you're playing like the AI, which is very, very doubtful. Alright, and now let's take a look at what I would like to see here when it comes to the order of battle. Currently, just for the record, we have zero accountability. There is no order of battle. There is nothing going on like that. Even within the military formation, yes, we are within the same military formation, which means we're assigned to the same location. We do not have any type of hierarchy. Not to mention, of course, that Even military formations do not have any resemblance of hierarchy between them, which fundamentally is kind of okay, but of course, you know, at the very least within the military formations, that should not be the case. Let's assume that we have, again, 200 battalions. Here is what I would like to see. I would like to see Field Marshal A on top of the entire thing. And then to keep it simple for the most simple of things, that Commander A currently has two people underneath them, and that is Commander B and Commander C. Maybe they split the troops equally, but let's just say, for the sake of argument here, that C has 120 troops, and then we got this fella right here with 80 troops. Random weights doesn't really matter. The point here being, we have a very clear leader. If something succeeds, if an activity succeeds, that leader will be the one that gets most, of course, of the glory, unless somebody did something heroic here at the front line. We also have people that, should their leader no longer exist, are right there to potentially move up. Right now, and this has to be mentioned, if a field marshal dies, that field marshal, his position is given away to some random person. I basically am in a position where I would like to see somebody to phase in, right? For example, in the Navy in Britain, it was very, very common to say if you were in the Cape Station, in the Cape of Africa station, or if you were in the station that was in the Atlantic, those were the bad stations. There was a lot of sickness, it wasn't really cool, there weren't a lot of urban cities that you could explore, have fun, and that sort of stuff. People hated being there, which is why it was important that when a free slot opened up, for example, in Britain itself, that is where those folks would want to go. And I think that is interesting. Now, the second part here, which means that there would even be cross-promotions, quote-unquote, within or from a military formation to another military formation, that is even further back, right? But where I'm coming from here on a very basic level is that I think within a military formation, there should indeed be a hierarchy. And that hierarchy should also actually then act out how battles are proceeding, right? You would have different troops getting different bonuses. I could give C, for example, a lot of crack troopers, and then B has the general troops. So C comes in to clean up whatever is going on, to really push in, and then B is the support troops right there. This would mean that we would get combined bonuses from different generals, that our generals would generally matter less the further we go, because let's say it's 1914, instead of having 200 troops and then 120 and 80, each commander under A may just have 20 troops or something. The modifiers would be different, and what would matter more would be the doctrinal underlying, sort of the underlying framework that you have erected for your army. This would also make it so, and this goes now much, much further, which is, again, why I'm saying this is not coming in the beta, but this is something that when I heard about military formations, I hope they had gone for, instead of the fairly lax system that we have right now. It would also mean that, seriously, as you go, building a military structure is important, but it can also be detrimental. At the very start, and this lasted, especially in the German Empire, for example, and I mean, there are so many different stages of this in Britain. If you ever look into this, it's super interesting, where you could buy your positions, where you would be fathered into your positions, right? And those were during the period of quote-unquote professional armies. It just wasn't the way that we imagine it today, for example. To reform away from this then becomes an inherently political process, which currently just isn't the case. Currently, this guy gives, what is it, like plus 10%, or is it even plus 20% IG cloud? I'm not sure. But anyway, there's a bonus here, and let's say 2% is the bonus right here. These bonuses are simply applied. What I'm looking for is a hierarchy. And if I look at this fella right here, and this fella right here, for example, is very bad for a new modern type of warfare, I want to push them out. But I can't just retire them anymore, because there is a proper hierarchy going on here. Instead, I would start having to work for it. Again, this requires some more bespoke mechanisms for this, but this would make the selection of who serves in your military much more bespoke. Purging your military, for example, of old forces would be much more bespoke, rather than just not recruiting more candidates, right? That is a big, big problem where I'm coming from when it comes to this. As I described this, of course, it is very vague, purposely so, because this is not something that you can just troubleshoot or come up with an issue completely in theory. You need to test this, you need to implement this in different fashions, and I hope that long-term, the military formation organization on a personal level makes it so that we get a hierarchy, that we get a soft OOB. Because the way it is right now, I'm not too content. If, for example, very early on in the battle, right, let's say this is still Napoleonic warfare, we're invading Bohemia, we're looking at these two fellas right here. A says B attack there, C attack there. You could have two battles in one state with different odds because of different sub-commanders, but a general commander boost coming from A, and of course a general guidance as well. Where do we attack, what do we attack, why do we attack it, and so on. In the late game, this would matter on a much, much different scale. Because instead of just A overlooking B and C, A might be overlooking B all the way to, let's say, J, right? And if that is the case, we can attack with B to J in individual provinces with their individual troops and actually see individual commander success, individual commander failure, and doctrinal success and failure, depending on what they're good at, depending on what they're bad at. Now, is this uber complex? Well, it is certainly more complex, but I think it would be much, much better than just the flat hierarchy that we have right here, and it would also make it so that it actually matters on a systemic level where your commanders come from. Right now, it doesn't really matter all that much. Just make sure that you recruit whoever you want to buff and then push them up all the way to the highest command level, commander rank 5. This has been a big criticism of mine, of the existing system, and military formations now carry this forward, falsely sort of going into a position where it never changes through time, but I think it should, which then also would directly feed into military academies, yada yada yada. You have all heard this by now 15 times over, but I just want to make this clear, even a very basic order of battle system would be much better in my eyes compared to this flat now integrated system that we currently have. There is no hierarchy, there ought to be one. I hope that eventually we shall be seeing that inside of the military formations. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about is mobilization options, and this is super important for me because honestly I feel like this is much more viable to implement even short-term, again, probably not with the beta, but short-term compared to a proper OOB system. Now, here's what I mean here, okay? When we see the mobilization options, let's say you have the option A, B, and C for something particular, like, for example, what kind of rations are you getting? This gives you a certain percentage modifier, this gives you a different percentage modifier, and this gives you, yet again, a different modifier. You select whatever you select, and that is the way it is, okay? I think, fundamentally, this does the game and the depth of combat a disservice. Now, this is regardless, and we aren't sure whether that is the case now, but this is regardless of whether there is an equipment change modifier like we have it currently in the game or not. So again, just as a reminder, currently if you change a secondary PM, some of the stats are inhibited, they are worse off. So for example, machine gunners is right here, and then over here we got flamethrowers. If I switch from this to this, I will get a negative modifier, right? This may or may not be in the beta as well with the mobilization options, but I don't think that it actually matters because I think this, the modifier that reduces itself and then gives the full bonus that flamethrowers can give, I think that is the exact opposite of how this should work. So let's dive into this. I'm super excited for this, but I hope that I can actually bring it across because maybe I can't. My ideal dream of how all the materialistic conditions of how you can outfit and train your troops, your military formations, of how that can work is basically something that I would roughly call military cohesion. Now, in what I'm about to say, you may recognize some elements, obviously, from other games that have training values, that have XP values, but I don't think it is exactly the same, because it tries to go into a different direction. Where I'm coming here from, right, is very different from what Victoria 3 is doing right now, but again, not too different, although a bit different from what other games are doing. So, for example, if I have right here, and I see now that this is pretty hard to recognize, but that's okay, if I have machine guns and flamethrowers right here, and I equip them with machine guns, I want a ticking up modifier. Even if we're at peace, I want a ticking up modifier that says we understand how to utilize machine guns. And then if, for example, I focus on it, if I do exercises, if we ever get that type of mission, it should go even higher up. But it should, you know, sort of have an upper limit, because until you actually use this weaponry, how do you know of that upper limit? Now, if I go to war with machine guns active, I would, you know, go higher and higher up. This would also make it so that I don't need to demobilize to select a different type of weaponry. All it would mean, if I go from machine guns to flamethrowers, doesn't necessarily need to be mutually exclusive, but just for the sake of example, if I go from machine gun to flamethrowers, the effect that makes it so that I do not actually require mobilization is that I have no experience. I don't need an equipment change modifier. I need a modifier that just says, oh my god, I don't know exactly how to clear trenches with the flamethrowers, or maybe the flamethrowers aren't even ideal against the current enemy. Whatever it might be, we start here. And then as we see combat, as we see training, we start going up. And all of these values, wherever we are in quality, can then together get a cohesion. Picture this on a naval level. Let's say we have a station, so a fleet formation that is stationed in the Cape Station. This fleet formation would have certain viability and skill values, so again the experience right here, of certain missions. For example, patrolling the coast, hey, it requires you not just to do the mission, but to also to know the coast. If I move a station into a completely different part of the world, they will not be as efficient with their mission as where they already were, right? So if I restation this station, this value would go down for the same mission. This, for example, is patrolling, just for the record. If I transfer more vessels into this actual location, into this station, right, the experience would also go down, unless those vessels come from a formation that already has experience in this mission. So, for example, patrol mission is right here, then I transfer somebody in that we know is, for example, worse, boom, there you go. This would make it so, and this is very important now, that I can have the best navy in the world, but they won't be optimal. They will still be good, and they will probably sink any other ship in the world, but they won't be optimal if they're based in Britain. I send them to Singapore and then threaten Japan with whatever it is that I want to do to Japan. This navy would have a lower cohesion because they are now a different unit. They are in a different location. They're not as well versed in that location with whatever they're doing. And maybe you even change their tactics, their strategy selector, right? Where I'm coming from here is that as it stands currently, mobilization options are either on or they are not. They either give the bonus or they do not. But it arguably is a fact that if I have troops that have never seen combat equipped with flamethrower, those troops are not the same as troops that have seen combat with flamethrower, that know what is going on, that have experience in this, that maybe have even seen a commander rise up the ranks that is a very experienced soldier in actually utilizing the flamethrower. So where I'm coming from here is that my big hope long term is a military formation anchored XP value. I call it military unit cohesion, right? So that would basically say this military formation is very experienced with, for example, flamethrowers, machine guns. It is experienced with advancing. It is experienced in defending. It is in a position where it knows the region that it is stationed in, that it is active in, and will behave better than anything that gets transferred down and hadn't had any experience there. It might still be worse overall if its actual equipment is worse, if its supply status is worse, right? I hope you understand that obviously a massive battleship navy will still win against a navy that is, you know, just made of junks, I don't know the English pronunciation there, but the Chinese-built ships, right? They would still absolutely massacre them, but there's a difference between that battleship navy that has been stationed in Britain for ages, that has trained in the region, that has made sure that it understands the waters, the coastline, that it understands the currents, that it knows exactly what is going on, that has had one coherent strategy the entire time, compared to a navy that said, hey, I was stationed in Africa, was just pulled up here, and now I'm going to fight you. Clearly, there is somebody here that has more military cohesion in the region, in the strategy, and in the equipment that it is fighting with. And I think that that is something that really needs to be in the game. I love the idea of an order of battle, okay? Because I think there's a lot that you can do with this when it comes to military academies, with how you recruit your generals and your admirals, with what the sort of the rubbing off on one another is, right? How easy it is to get a doctrine out of your commanders, to get another doctrine into your commanders by educating them in the same military academy and so on and so forth. I love that idea. When we take a look at this, again, there's clearly just an on or off. Effects on all battalions in this army. And I think that shouldn't be the case. I think these effects should scale with how much you have used it, with how much the commanders are used to it, with how much this military formation is used to it. And then, once you combine all the mobilization options, you should then again combine this with how experienced is this military formation with this task, or how experienced is it in this region, how experienced is it fighting this particular equipment. All of these things would add the depth that is desperately, desperately needed. This already adds depth, don't get me wrong here, but I think it is far too static. The idea and the very experience of a military knowing what war looks like, and what the shortcomings of particular usage cases are, that is something that we currently cannot pull up. Now, I'm not advocating, and I think this is important, for unit experience. I do not think, and maybe I'm wrong here, maybe they could do this, but I do not think that it's necessary to have particular unit experience. You could simply handle it like pops. If a unit formation splits by me transferring out units, simply take the same stats that this general pop had and push it into the other pop. Push it into the same equipment knowledge. So if I have 100 battalions in something that has 100% experience with flamethrowers, and I move it over into a military formation that has 0% flamethrower experience, maybe if I move enough units over, that military formation experience with flamethrowers gives now 50% experience to that new military formation. It's still worse, but it gives you a head start. And it would allow you to do a whole lot of things with military experience, and of course, just in general, I mean, how that stuff works. Now, I do want to stress, if both of these were difficult to follow, I completely understand this. But if you follow what I want to get at here, the mobilization options, the combat unit types, the military formations, the way commanders work, all of it would make a lot more sense if there was an actual commander hierarchy that you have to worry about, that changes, that becomes more intense, but ultimately becomes less face-oriented, because only the most important commanders will matter at this point, because it's a systemic kind of warfare. Again, your small lieutenant has more freedom in the army of Napoleonic warfare compared in the army of trench warfare. If you take all these things and were to actually put them in with a soft OOB, I don't want anything like Hoi 3 as much as I love the aesthetics, if you put that in, and if you made mobilization options something that tracks experience with these options in a particular military formation, all of a sudden, military formation A and military formation B would be different, depending on what kind of experience, depending on how long they had these skills. And I think that that is a really, really important thing. The Victorian age, and I said this at the very start, in particular is a period of industrialization of warfare, which means that the underlying systems, the underlying experience, and the doctrine of what occurs becomes more and more important the longer we go. Obviously, the supply is incredibly important, and that is now very well implemented right here. But these mobilization options disappoint me in the sense that they are on or off toggles. And again, even if there is a change equipment malus, which I can't see here, but even if that were the case, I don't think it actually matters. If we had cohesion, if we had an active war, and I exchange one of the mobilization options while we're fighting, obviously my troops will initially perform worse, but then as they have battles, as they kill and are killed, would rack up more experience and more skill with a particular set of options, and all of a sudden would become more coherent, and so on and so forth. The whole thing where I need to demobilize them would no longer be necessary for a balancing thing, because it self-balances. I just gave them something they don't know, they perform worse, but will perform better long term. And I think that is where we need to be, quite frankly. Now, when it comes to these ideas, again, I don't think that they're going to be implemented anytime soon, if ever at all. Not that I want to phrase it this way. It's more that I say this with a long-lasting outlook, right? I think military formations are the right step for this system, but I think when it comes to OOBs and when it comes to these mobilization options, there's a lot that we can look forward to, because tracking military formations cohesion is great. There's this really interesting pivot, and I already cut into this a bit earlier, but I think it's the perfect example for this, right? It's the pivot when, at the turn of the 20th century, so 1900 and onwards, the British Empire recognized that, yes, being world police makes sense, and it has brought a lot of prosperity, but with the rivalry slowly turning more intense in Europe, it was time to shift. And you can really track, there's a beautiful website that actually does this, but you can really track how they pivoted their ships from the Mediterranean station, the Cape station, how they dissolved certain stations and pivoted these vessels into their home fleet. They created, obviously, the home fleet was a new design that then was dissolved after the war, but you know how it is. Now, where I'm coming from here is this pivot is super, super important. If the war breaks out and that pivot hasn't been done, there is no functional fleet that knows exactly how to work together, that has done exercises together, that knows the doctrine of how to actually, hold formation and so on. They have not cooperated in this fashion. Instead, they start pivoting come 1900 and so. In the following years, more and more vessels are sent to the home fleet, and they gain cohesion. They gain knowledge of how to operate in these waters and how to operate together, how to operate with the mission that is very likely the one to be used against the German Empire. In this case, of course, containing their fleet and then challenging them to a decisive battle. That was the doctrine that both the Germans and the British were following at the time. I find it very interesting, because right now I have the feeling that if I just pivot units in there, and be it military, so on the land warfare side or the water side of things, if I just shoot units into a military formation, it just works. They just show up and they're like, hey, I'm here, let's fight, let's do it. Obviously, they take their time, but the military cohesion isn't impacted at all. And I think if we take a look at this, both from, again, an equipment point of view, but also a doctrinal point of view, there's a lot to gain here by simply saying we need to make sure that you cannot pivot your entire army to Asia. You cannot just station this entire army in Asia or this entire fleet in Asia and expect them to operate as though they were where they previously were. You cannot just split a military formation and expect these new split formations to be as efficient as the formations that we're used to operating, for example, in South Africa. If military mobilization options made that pivot and allowed you to really be good just because you have had this much routine and training in a particular section. It would be more painful, but also more gainful to change out of these operational procedures, because redeploying and learning the new, the better long-term procedures would give you an edge long-term. Right now, there's always an optimal path. I can foresee this not being the case with this, because there's clearly more to it, right? But I think military cohesion makes it so that even two units with the same tech can perform completely differently from one another. And that is good, because especially in 1914, I'm sorry to say this, but military genius was much less in demand than simply manpower supply, simply efficiency and knowledge of the tools that were given to you, doctrinal knowledge and so on. So with that in mind, the pivot from we have these great commanders to we need to have cohesion of the equipment and the knowledge and the doctrine and so on and so forth would be a viability, or would be viable to be implemented in the game with these options. I'm super eager for this, and again, for the first time now, I have actually the impression that this can be implemented, because the previous systems relied so much on generals and admirals. It just kind of makes this impossible. So I hope that long term we're walking towards this, but I want to bring this up to summarize this whole thing. Because as enamored as I am with the changes, I would love a soft order of battle, and I would love to have an actual military formation cohesion matter for how well we're performing, and then of course how that reflects on the commanders long term. I would absolutely love that, and I hope that it's coming, but seeing all the changes that we have here, really, really cool, but bam, now the floodgates are open. We can move so much further with this, right? Yeah, let's hope that this implementation really works so that they can then indeed move on, because man, I would be screaming if we actually had a dedicated system of developing the military complex, of making it complex in the first place, to do a bit of a wordplay there. So I want to know what you think about this, because man, I would love this. Again, I don't think a unit tier, so a unit level experience is needed. You don't need to track that, I don't think. But I do think military formation, and then, for example, how well commanders can deal with these strategies, that should also be tracked instead of generic traits. I would love it if commanders basically were like, oh yeah, I have experience with machine guns, I'm great with this. But then the old guard says, I can't really learn all that much more, maybe I'm too old, and that is why you want them out of the door, rather than just because they're part of the landowners. Listen, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. Let me know what you think, but that is my input for this dev diary in itself. Again, with my big dreams. Let's talk about the dev diary responses. Alright, now here we have the first comment. Are the devs planning in streamlining, putting generals of the IGs we want in the army? I would consider revisiting which commanders spawn for the recruitment pool. Right now, there's some conditional logic that influences which commanders you have available to you at any given time, and maybe we can give more players more ways of influencing that, but I do not want to just give players full control of which IG to recruit from either. Part of the fun for me at least is that you have a limited number of options at any given time, forcing me to occasionally choose between the perfect candidate from an IG I don't want to empower, or a substandard candidate from an IG that agrees with me. A more attractive option, to me, to solve the problem you're presenting is to actually allow the pool to empty out and only refill over time, as more pops become educated to become officers. In the past, we haven't been able to do this, since commanders were always required to maintain your troops, but since you could now create another formation even though you don't have any commanders to lead them, this again becomes a possibility. I'm super mixed on this. I want military academies. I want the choice of which commander takes over when, not me being literally clicking this, seeing three candidates and selecting one. I want that choice to be made on the military academy level, okay? I want to have to reform out of buying military titles. I want to, and I want to do this in the context of the military academy, I want to formalize military education. I want to select, hey, maybe we produce more people that know flamethrowers because we have more military unit cohesion with flamethrowers and so on. I want this sort of stuff to be solved in a much more interesting level than the recruitment pool. I really gotta say, I am not a fan of the recruitment pool. I find it very boring. Stellaris has it. I do not love it at all. Yeah, especially with something like the Victorian era, where it was so important, again in France, that the École de Guerre, for example, and in other locations with the Oberste Heeresleitung and so on, that they started to take over, that it became a much more top-down process, but from a professional, from an academy level. That is something that I want to see reflected, and it's just not in there, and I don't think a recruitment pool can actually do it justice, although I'm definitely interested in basically how many officer pops you have, limiting that to a degree. That's a cool thing. Now this one is a bit of a side note. Out of curiosity, have the devs started looking into connecting wars and domestic opinions, making pops actually pro/anti-war? Not for this update. We're considering ways of making pops and IGs care about diplomatic relations for the sphere of influence expansion, though. Please, I beg you. I need that, and we need it both for war, but also for nationalism. I think it's very, very important in both of these aspects. This one is also quite interesting. So we're trying to give armies more concrete locations on the map and having them actually travel to fronts. Does this mean military access will become a thing, beyond just having access to allies' territory? I'm thinking more in terms of EU4, where you have a diplomatic pact with another country to allow your army to move through their territory. It can be frustrating not being able to send your army to certain fronts because you don't have direct land access to them via your allies. This can be problematic, as Prussia, for example, if you go to war with Denmark, Schleswig and Holstein, but are forced to naval invade because you can't ask Hanover for military access if they aren't an ally. Will we be able to ask countries for military access to be able to travel to otherwise inaccessible fronts and form a front on the border of a country that has allowed us military access? So, the response here is actually completely correct, but obviously we need a functionality here. It's come up in design discussions, and with a new Pathfinder, it would be more feasible for us to implement something like this. One issue here is historicity. In this era of nationalism, it was quite rare for countries to just march their armed forces across another nation's territory, without that nation being under occupation, that is. It doesn't exactly ring true to me that to allow countries to have permanent military access pacts with one another outside the context of a particular war. Ideally, I would want it to be an arrangement negotiated in the context of a particular war and irrevocable for that war. We have to say here, the Prussia example right now is super annoying. It sucks, okay? Especially for the AI. But the Prussian example is actually a really bad one, because that Prussian engagement, together with Austria in 1861 and before that in 1848, 1849, when they fought the Danish over Schleswig, was not an example of Prussia going, I will now declare war against this. This was an act of the German Confederation that said the German Confederation must reclaim those territories from Denmark. That is a completely different international incident, if you get my drift. I'm not saying that the commenter here isn't right. Obviously they are. Military access being completely non-present unless they're allies or unless you violate their sovereignty, it sucks. But fundamentally, the most cited example is a really bad one, because technically the entire German Confederation was involved in this, technically. So yeah, I get it. I hope that they do implement something here, but just keep that in mind. It was a very specific, a highly specific international example that is specific to the German Confederation and, well, with that, probably to spheres of influence coming next year. And now this one, I think you will know where I'm coming from. Why design it again in a way so that we cannot modify our units with additional supply? Got more food and clothes to be able to equip your troops with better rations and uniforms? Not possible, because you need to demobilize your army. Got new tech for weapons like machine guns? Too bad, we can't transfer them to the front line. Each soldier needs to come home and pick one up themselves. You can't go into proper war economy to help the war effort or invest into military research. That is the opposite, like I think wars should play out. I want to be able to adjust my economy and go all in if I desired in the current war like in World War I. Not waiting for the next war, because military progress can't happen in my country unless troops are demobilized. It was not possible to do this so far, because switching production methods made your military Bronze Age soldiers and unaware what a rifle even is. Now it would still not be possible to adapt during the war. Obviously, very polemic message, but let's take a look at the answer. I'm not entirely clear on where you're coming from here, to be honest. This system does permit you to send your troops home to remobilize with different armaments without penalty. If you research some new tech, and here's confirmed actually, without penalty, so when you change mobilization option, there is no penalty. If you research some new tech during the war or decide you want to spend more or less on them than you had planned originally, there's a time factor to consider for doing so, which seems perfectly rational to me. The mobilization mechanic, now as always, is intended as a way for you to have to pre-plan a bit how many of your armed forces you want to commit to a given conflict, not to let you min-max damage output just before a battle breaks out, for example. This will still happen. People will simply rotate in and rotate out troops. It'll just be ultra tedious. I'm not saying that they should be doing this. It's semi-exploity. Well, not really. It's cheesy. Let me call it this. But it will happen. It's a guarantee. That is a weakness of the system. I personally entirely believe this. If you had a cohesion factor, you could exchange it, but they would be worse off fundamentally, and then build it up rather than it going down and disappearing entirely forever. They would build it up. They would build up XP. They would be like, we know how to work with this. The way it is right now, people will simply rotate in and out their troops if they have a war, if they have a front line. The demobilization time is open for feedback to help figure out what the right balance is, and you can also restation an army to a closer HQ in subsequent beta releases with some effects on supply based on where your units are actually supplied from, to cut down on the travel time when demobilizing. No, I think the demobilization requirement is not a good requirement. It runs counter to the idea of, well, how World War I happened. I think fundamentally, I get the idea. it's the attempt, right, to balance out changes to your equipment. But ultimately, I do again believe that we just will have rotations once you get a new tech. You will keep some troops there, make sure that you have enough troops demobilized so that they can pick up new things, then mobilize them, demobilize the rest, mobilize them, boom. I think that is not a good idea because you end up even faster than you normally would with an army that is fully equipped and has no penalties whatsoever to its new abilities. Again, let's say we have 2 army groups, I demobilize 1 flamethrowers, I put them back in action, flamethrowers all of a sudden with full energy active, I demobilize these, put flamethrowers in, boom, all of a sudden, full mobilization, full skill set for the flamethrower available. I think huge mistake. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. It should be, you can exchange it, but if you were on machine gunners before that and you were super experienced, at least until you gather the experience to fight with flamethrowers, you will be worse off, right? But it depends on how much action you see, on how much your quality rises up, your cohesion rises up in general, you know, with training and such. Way better than the demobilization rotation. I think it's a big mistake. Anyway. Alright, and then we have this one. Also, couldn't the general problem be fixed by allowing a single general to preside over multiple battles if needed? We want to try to avoid the solutions, and it means we couldn't give you the precise map location for a particular military resource, which is one of our main goals for this update. It's also weird on very long fronts to see the same guy in 2 places. I get it, but, you know, okay. Again, here's where I come in, and where I say, I think, how many states on a front line you can advance in at the same time, how many offensives you can start, should be tied to technology and equipment of your units. And then if you have a soft OOB in your military formation, what you can do is, you have a field marshal on top, then 5 characters underneath, and if you can start 3 battles, one of the 5 characters will participate in those battles. So 3 battles and then 3 active characters, 2 passive characters. That way, you can have multiple attacks with multiple characters led by the same field marshal, but by different sub-commanders, making it less weird. People are committed to different fronts or to different locations, and it would work. At the same time, how many battles you can start, in my opinion, should never be open to just how many generals you have or how many commanders you have in any unit. It should be dependent on your tech. It should be dependent on your infrastructure. If those things are present, let's say you have trench warfare, maybe you can start 4 battles at the same time. If you have the most basic thing, maybe it's 2 battles. Maybe with trench warfare, maybe it's 8. But again, I actually want to differentiate here a channel internal term. The game doesn't use it this way. When we start a battle somewhere, I would like to call this an offensive. And there can be battles of part of an offensive. Because again, I still think we should see offensives with multiple battles at the same time that are basically just split up battles. Again, if you have trench warfare, you would do 1 offensive into Bohemia, but that offensive might trigger 8 battles at the same time. That could easily be supervised by the same characters because it's in such close proximity. Anyway, I think definitely that is a pain point. That is a pain point that this won't fix yet. Maybe long term. And here we at least see this partially confirmed. You're right that it's not going to happen right now, but we will be working on creating a kind of pyramidal rank structure of commanders within a formation, and we can't wait to actually leverage that for cool political effects and events in the future. I really hope that that comes with military academies. How commanders are recruited shouldn't be the way it is right now. But the fact that they long-term are looking towards this is very positive, and hopefully also bodes well for, you know, how battles are selected, how they can be selected, and how many offensives you can have going at the same time. Now this is great news for me. I hope that formations force the player to not put every barrack in their capital, as that allows cheesing civil wars under certain circumstances. This is more of a problem with the fact that civil wars always exclude the capital rather than, in some circumstances, splitting it. I really want us to change how revolution state selection is managed for this reason and others. Thank you. Yes, I need that changed. Now this one, and I'm bringing everything back to what I want, okay, don't get me wrong here, maybe a recruitment of foreign officer option that allows you to equip units under that officer's command with tech equivalents from the source country. We're considering some sort of land aid option for sphere of influence, and the formation system gives us a nice layer to use here. We will see. If we have military cohesion, I can export knowledge to you that drives up the cohesion, the knowledge of how to utilize certain weapons, artillery, and so on and so forth that your country currently lacks. Whether you have the tech, whether you don't have the tech, whether you produce that, whether you don't produce it. I could supply you, and I could give you the tech. If you don't have military cohesion, you just unlock a PM, and the nation that you just informed about this knowledge, right, can use flamethrowers just as well as you can, because this mobilization option is just the way it is. I'm just saying, military cohesion would be great. Ooh, and I think we have a bit of a... We have something that could be very annoying. I didn't actually see this before. First of all, great DD. This is way more than I was expecting and all around a great change. The only thing I'm utterly confused about is occupation. What does it do exactly? When you have enough occupation, then you take a province, or maybe it determines how many provinces you get after a battle, or does it affect war score? Occupation builds up in a state as a result of battle, and when total occupation reaches 100%, the country/front with the most occupation gains the state and the front moves. War score, through war exhaustion, is affected even before that, based on the occupation percentage you have reached. But you have to capture the whole state to make it count as a captured war goal, and bring the enemy below 0 war support. So I like the latter part. The first part, oh god, there's gonna be edge cases for this. People will be really annoyed by this. If you fight over the same state, if you have 49%, you get nothing out of it. You get nothing out of it. That's going to be really annoying. That is going to be really annoying in the edge cases when you encounter it. I don't know whether there is a better solution, though. Yeah, I'm not sure whether there is a better solution. But you just get nothing. Your progress gets rolled back as well. Let's say you have 49%, boom, state flips to the other front end of the other war that is attacking the person you're also attacking. Then that war ends and you need to retake the entire state because you lost your 49%. That's going to be rough. That is going to get a lot of frustration, I think. And now here's something rather surprising for me. Not sure exactly what this would look like, but interesting to mention nonetheless. This was a pleasure of a DD to read. Very excited for the upcoming changes. The increased options for mobilization is something I didn't realize I needed until it was brought up. Would it continue to work as it does now, with the raised troops increasing demand for military goods? Or could a national stockpile be implemented to cushion some of the pain of having to deal with the increased demand? Yes, it works like it does currently. Some sort of stockpile system is something we're looking into, hopefully for release sometime 2024. We have a lot of ideas and see a good number of use cases for it, especially with local pricing. I'm curious about this, super curious about what this would look like. Is it just the military? Is it not just the military? The stockpile as it was in Victoria 2 was super... Well, obviously, it had its usage cases, don't get me wrong here. But I think the vast majority of players did not actually use it all that much. So this would have to be a mechanic that is more in the foreground, no matter how you implement it, to actually, you know, sort of feature in how you plan your wars. Very interested in seeing this, but sometime 2024, it's long out. And now here just something short. Fortifications is something we have on our list of things to take a look at, but no concrete plans if and when to do that yet. I think doing it now that we have state-based progression of fronts, very specifically, is actually much more viable than before. Before you weren't sure where exactly a battle would be triggered, and that means your fortifications could be utterly useless, or, well, you know, if you play with fortification mods. I've tried them, don't worry. They could be utterly useless or insanely overpowered. Now that you know what you're getting into as you try to claim a state, much more viable. Alright folks, and this is actually it now as well. This video has been long enough. And it's been a pain for me because it's so hard and it's so difficult to explain a lot of these things if you don't have mock-ups, sketches and so on. But yeah, from my perspective, let's summarize it all. I think that these are really, really welcome changes. I said ages ago at this point that what Victoria 3 needs most right now is simply getting rid of all the stuff that is annoying. The stuff that makes you rage quit, the stuff that makes you go, oh my god, I don't want to play anymore because I don't want to be the one bending over backwards for the game to function. That is something that is largely being addressed right here. The military formations, everything related to that, related to the mobilization goods and such, as well as of course the front lines and how they advance, is fundamentally designed to make it more nice to interact with it. Just, you know, put it into a position where you don't feel great pain with it. Beyond that is something that I think is now healthy to think about. Previously I didn't really do that because, you know, you gotta get it fixed first before you go further. And I will say that I would really be in love if what we see right here developed further into a proper soft OOB system, into a military academy system, and of course into unit or, well, military formation cohesion system, into a system that allows you to basically have genuine differences between your military formations based on how active they have participated in war, based on how long they have been in a region, based on how long they have had a certain command structure, as well as, of course, a certain task and equipment. I mean, that goes without saying. All of these things would be really lovely to see in the game. They're not coming anytime soon, but I would ask you to leave a comment with what you think about it, with what you think about the changes as they're in right now, and what you think about the changes that I propose if you were able to follow, because again, super difficult to convey that in an adequate way from my side. Either way, leave your comments. I will read all of them as always, even if I don't respond to all of them. I will make sure to take everything into consideration and, of course, change my point of view from there as well. Let me know what you think, and I will now lie down and stop sweating, hopefully, and I'll see you later, alligator.